Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet corner of the night, where mysteries unfold in whispers and the world slows to the gentle rhythm of falling snow. Tonight, we journey together to Victorian London on a Christmas Eve wrapped in fog and firelight, where the impossible becomes merely improbable, and sleep finds you softly through the unfolding of an extraordinary tale. This story is meant to slow your thoughts, to ease you into peaceful rest, and perhaps to bring you dreams of gaslit streets and cozy hearths. So, wherever you find yourself tonight, whether near or far, I wonder what distant corner of the world cradles you in this moment. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The snow fell upon London like a benediction that Christmas Eve, each flake descending through the amber glow of gas lamps with deliberate, drowsy grace. At 221B Baker Street, the rooms of Sherlock Holmes existed as an island of warmth against the winter darkness, the fire in the hearth crackling with a voice both ancient and comforting. The flames cast dancing shadows across the Persian slipper hanging near the mantelpiece, across the violin resting in its accustomed corner, across the chemistry apparatus that gleamed like strange sculpture in the firelight. Holmes himself sat in his favourite armchair, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, grey eyes reflecting the hypnotic movement of the fire as he contemplated some invisible problem in the smoke-wreathed air. Dr. John Watson occupied the chair opposite, a medical journal open upon his lap, though his attention had drifted to the window, where frost traced intricate patterns across the glass like nature's own calligraphy. The room held that particular quality of silence found only on winter nights, a hush so complete that one could hear the soft settling of ash in the grate, the gentle tick of the clock upon the mantel, the barely perceptible whisper of snow against window panes. Mrs. Hudson had departed an hour earlier, leaving behind a tea service that steamed gently upon the table between them, the scent of Earl Grey mingling with the warmer notes of pipe tobacco and old leather. Watson lifted his teacup with careful reverence, the china making the softest clink against its saucer, and sipped the brew that had cooled to that perfect temperature between hot and warm. Outside, somewhere in the blanketed streets below, a carol drifted up from a group of singers, their voices carrying through the still air like something from a dream, rising and falling with the melody of God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, before fading into the snow-muffled distance. Holmes stirred slightly at the sound, but said nothing, his gaze remaining fixed upon whatever internal landscape occupied his formidable mind. The knock, when it came, seemed to emerge from the very fabric of the winter night itself, not loud, not insistent, but persistent in its quiet repetition against the door below. 3 measured raps, a pause, then 3 more, as though whoever stood in the December cold had learned patience through some hard experience. Watson glanced toward Holmes, who had already unfolded from his chair with that sudden, graceful alertness that characterized all his movements, like a cat waking from apparent sleep. 11:47, Holmes murmured, consulting his pocket watch as the firelight caught its golden surface. An unconventional hour for a social call, and yet the knock suggests neither emergency nor desperation. Curious, Watson. Quite curious. The sound of Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted up the stairs, muted and apologetic, followed by heavier footsteps, ascending with deliberate slowness. When the visitor appeared in the doorway, both men found themselves regarding a figure that seemed to have stepped from some earlier century. The man who stood before them, snow melting from the shoulders of a heavy woolen greatcoat, possessed a face of indeterminate age, weathered by experience yet unlined, with eyes of such pale blue they appeared almost colourless in the lamplight. He held a leather satchel close to his chest, and his breath came in small clouds of vapour, despite the warmth of the room. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the stranger said, his voice carrying the soft burr of Cornwall, or perhaps Devon, each word shaped with care, as though he spoke a language learned long ago and carefully preserved. "I apologise for the lateness of the hour and the intrusion upon your Christmas Eve. My name is Alistair Crowe, and I have travelled far to seek your counsel on a matter most peculiar and, I fear, impossible to explain without sounding quite mad." Holmes gestured toward the chair Watson had occupied, while the doctor himself moved to stand by the fire, ever the gracious host. "Please, Mr. Crowe, do sit. Watson, perhaps you would be so kind as to pour our guests some tea. The cold has clearly gripped you thoroughly." He settled back into his own chair, fingers once more finding their steepled position beneath his chin. "As for madness, I have found that the world contains far more impossibilities than most people credit. Tell me your story, and let us judge together the degree of its impossibility." Crowe lowered himself into the offered chair with visible relief, setting the satchel carefully at his feet before accepting the cup Watson extended. His hands, Holmes noted, trembled slightly, though whether from cold or some deeper perturbation remained unclear. The visitor sipped the tea with evident gratitude, and colour began to return to his pale cheeks. Outside, the snow continued its patient descent, and the fire settled deeper into its glowing bed of coals, sending a shower of tiny sparks up the chimney like ascending stars. "I am a scholar, Mr. Holmes," Crowe began, his voice finding steadiness as warmth returned to his limbs. "My particular study concerns folklore and mythology of the British Isles, with emphasis on transformation legends, tales of shapeshifters and skinwalkers that persist in rural communities from Scotland to Cornwall. For 15 years I have collected these stories, catalogued them, searched for their historical roots and rational explanations." He paused, took another sip of tea, the cup rattling almost imperceptibly against the saucer. "3 months ago, I began to suspect that one particular legend might be rather more than mere superstition." The clock struck midnight with deep, resonant chimes that seemed to hang in the air long after the mechanism fell silent. Watson found himself counting each note unconsciously, watching the expressions that played across Crowe's weathered face like shadows on water. Holmes remained utterly still, only his eyes moving, cataloguing every detail of their unexpected guest with that peculiar intensity that meant his considerable intellect had engaged fully with the puzzle presented. "Before you fall asleep, write in the comments what time it is for you and where you are from." Crowe set down his teacup and reached for the leather satchel, withdrawing from it a journal bound in dark leather, its pages yellowed with age and handling. "This belonged to my grandfather, who was vicar in a small village called Ashcroft, nestled in the Dartmoor Hills. He kept meticulous records of the parish, including local legends he collected from elderly parishioners. One story appears repeatedly across 20 years of entries, always told in hushed tones, always concerning the same family, the Marlowes of Thornfield Manor." Holmes leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking softly beneath his weight, and extended one slender hand toward the joined hand toward the journal Crowe held. The scholar passed it across with visible reluctance, as though parting with something precious and possibly dangerous. The fire chose that moment to shift in the grate, sending a cascade of embers tumbling down with a gentle susurration that seemed to punctuate the transfer. Watson moved closer, drawn by the promise of mystery unfolding, and found himself standing just behind Holmes's chair, where he could observe the yellowed pages as his friend began to turn them with careful, deliberate movements. The handwriting within revealed itself in neat, cramped script. The ink faded to sepia, but still legible in the lamplight. Each entry began with a date, spanning from 1847 to 1868, and the vicar's observations possessed a quality both scholarly and deeply unsettled. Holmes's eyes moved rapidly across the first page, then slowed, his brow furrowing slightly as he absorbed whatever he found there. The silence in the room deepened, broken only by the whisper of turning pages and the eternal conversation between fire and wood in the hearth. "The Marlowe family," Crowe continued, his voice dropping to a tone suited for confidences shared in dim rooms, "lived at Thornfield Manor for 3 centuries, always maintaining distance from the village, always shrouded in peculiar circumstances. My grandfather's entries describe them as generous landlords, never failing to provide for their tenants, yet rarely seen by daylight. When they did venture into the village, it was noted that they seemed to shimmer at the edges, as though not quite solid, not quite fixed in their forms." Watson poured himself more tea, the liquid streaming from pot to cup with a sound like gentle rain, and resumed his position by the fire. The warmth radiated against his back, a pleasant contrast to the cold that seemed to emanate from the journal itself, as though it carried within its pages not merely words, but the chill of ancient mysteries. Outside, the snow had intensified, building small drifts against the windowsill, each flake visible for a moment in the lamplight, before joining the white blanket that transformed London into something from a fairy tale. Holmes turned another page, paused, then turned back, comparing 2 entries with narrowed eyes. "Your grandfather writes here of a Christmas gathering in 1852, he said, his finger tracing a particular passage. He notes that young Thomas Marlowe appeared at the church service on Christmas morning, but 3 different parishioners swore they had seen the same young man in 3 separate locations at the same moment, each witness describing him in identical detail, yet placing him miles apart." "Precisely," Crowe said, leaning forward with an intensity that made the firelight cast strange shadows across his features. "And that is merely one incident among dozens. In 1861, the entire family attended a harvest festival, all 5 of them present and accounted for. Yet the innkeeper's wife insisted she had served dinner to Lady Marlowe alone in his establishment, that very same evening, at the exact hour when the woman stood in plain view of 30 witnesses at the festival." The clock on the mantel ticked steadily onward, measuring out the moments with mechanical precision, while the humans in the room contemplated impossible contradictions. Watson found his medical training asserting itself, searching for rational explanations. Twins, perhaps, or elaborate hoaxes designed to maintain the family's mysterious reputation. Yet something in Crowe's manner, in the careful documentation within that ancient journal, suggested layers of strangeness that simple trickery could not explain. Holmes closed the journal with a soft thud and set it upon the table beside his teacup, which had grown cold and filmed over with a delicate skin. His grey eyes had taken on that distant quality Watson recognized, the the look of a mind constructing and demolishing theories at tremendous speed, sorting through possibilities with the efficiency of a sorting machine in some vast postal facility. The fire crackled suddenly, a pocket of resin igniting with a sharp snap that made all three men glance toward the hearth, where flames leaped higher for a moment before settling back into their steady consumption of the logs. "You said you began to suspect this was more than superstition 3 months ago," Holmes said, his voice cutting through the ambient sounds with quiet precision. "What changed? What transformed historical curiosities into a matter urgent enough to bring you to my door on Christmas Eve?" Crow's hands tightened around his teacup, knuckles whitening slightly, and he drew a breath that seemed to require effort. The Marlowe family disappeared in 1869, vanished without trace from Thornfield Manor, leaving behind all their possessions and no indication of their destination. The manor stood empty for decades, slowly falling into disrepair, until it was purchased this past summer by a London merchant named Whitmore, who knew nothing of its history. He has been renovating the property, preparing it for occupation. The scholar paused, set down his cup with trembling care, and withdrew from his coat pocket a folded newspaper which he smoothed open upon his knee. The paper dated from 3 weeks prior, and Watson could see the headline even from his position by the fire. "Mysterious occurrences plague Dartmoor estate." Crow's finger found a particular paragraph, and he read aloud, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Workers at Thornfield Manor report disturbing phenomena during renovation work. Figures are observed in rooms confirmed to be empty. Tools vanish and reappear in impossible locations. Most disturbing, Foreman James Hendricks swears he encountered the same woman in 3 different parts of the building simultaneously. Each instance of her appearance solid and corporeal. Each woman responding to his queries before vanishing like morning mist." Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night beyond the windows. He moved unconsciously closer to the fire, seeking its reassurance, while Holmes rose from his chair with that sudden fluidity that always preceded action. The detective crossed to the window, hands clasped behind his back, and stood gazing out at the snow-transformed street below, where gas lamps created pools of golden light in the white darkness. "The Marlowes have returned," Crow said quietly, and in those 4 words lay a weight of certainty that filled the warm room with something cold and strange. Or perhaps they never truly left. 3 workers have abandoned the project, unwilling to continue despite generous wages. Whitmore himself wrote to me last week, having learned of my grandfather's connection to the parish, and hoping I might provide some historical context for these disturbances. When I travelled there to investigate, I experienced the phenomenon myself. Holmes turned from the window, his profile sharp against the frost-traced glass, and in his expression Watson saw the kindling of that peculiar excitement that gripped his friend when confronted with a problem truly worthy of his faculties. The violin in the corner seemed to wait in sympathetic anticipation, and the shadows cast by the firelight appeared to lean inward, as though the very room itself listened with bated breath. "Tell us," Holmes said simply, and in the quiet command lay invitation and challenge both. Outside, church bells began to toll the quarter hour, their sound muffled by snow and distance, marking time in a city that slumbered while mysteries awakened. Crow gathered himself, drew breath, and began to recount an experience that would draw all 3 men into the heart of an impossible enigma. where the boundary between legend and reality wore thin as morning mist. The ember that fell from Crow's pipe glowed briefly against the carpet, before Watson's boot extinguished it with a gentle press. The small interruption barely registering as the scholar found his voice and began to speak of things that defied the comfortable logic of the firelit room. His words came slowly at first, each sentence weighted with the burden of impossible memory, and Holmes remained motionless by the window, a silhouette against the snow-bright darkness, absorbing every detail with that frightening intensity that made him seem less a man than a finely calibrated instrument designed solely for the reception of information. I arrived at Thornfield Manor on a Tuesday afternoon, Crow began, his accent growing thicker as emotion threaded through his narrative. The day held that particular quality of late autumn light, golden and failing, casting long shadows across the Dartmoor landscape. The manor itself rises from a hillside like something grown rather than built. Grey stone that has weathered centuries of wind and rain until it seems almost part of the moorland itself. Whitmore met me at the gates, a practical man in his 50s, prosperous and dismissive of superstition. Yet even he moved through the entrance with a wariness that spoke of experiences that had shaken his certainties. Watson settled into the chair Crow had initially occupied, his medical bag resting against his leg out of long habit, and found himself transported by the scholar's words into that distant landscape of moor and stone. The fire whispered its agreement, flames curling around a fresh log that had just been placed upon the grate, the wood accepting its transformation with small sighs and cracks that punctuated Crow's tale like an accompanying score. The interior, Crow continued, his pale eyes distant now, seeing not the warm rooms of Baker Street, but something far away and strange, showed the marks of abandonment and attempted renewal existing side by side. Whitmore's workers had cleared debris from several rooms, revealing wallpaper in faded patterns of ivy and rose, floorboards that still held the indentations of furniture long since removed. Yet dust lay thick in corners, untouched by renovation, and the air itself tasted of time, of years compressed and preserved like flowers pressed between the pages of an ancient book. Holmes shifted position, the movement drawing Watson's attention to his friend's face, where the sharp features had taken on that carved quality that indicated total absorption in a problem. The detective's fingers tapped a silent rhythm against the window frame, some internal calculation manifesting in that unconscious gesture. Outside, a carriage passed in the street below, its wheels muffled by snow, the jingle of harness bells clear and bright in the winter air, before fading into the general hush that had settled over London. The scholar's teacup, forgotten in his hand, had grown cold once more, and Watson rose to refill it from the pot that Mrs. Hudson had left upon the warmer. The sound of liquid pouring seemed loud in the attentive silence, and Crow accepted the fresh cup with a nod of gratitude before continuing his tale. Steam rose from the tea in delicate spirals, catching the firelight and seeming to dance in the air between the three men. I had been examining the books for perhaps 20 minutes when I became aware of another presence in the room. Not a sound, you understand, not footsteps or breathing, but that unmistakable sense of being observed that raises the hairs upon one's neck. I turned, expecting to find Whitmore returned, or perhaps one of the workers, and instead I saw a woman standing near the door I had entered through, watching me with an expression of mild curiosity. Crow paused, took a sip of tea with hands that had begun to tremble once more, and Watson noticed that Holmes had turned from the window now, giving the scholar his complete and undivided attention. The clock's ticking seemed to grow louder in the pause, measuring out seconds that stretched like honey, slow and golden and thick with anticipation. She wore a dress of dark green silk, styled in the fashion of perhaps 40 years prior, with her hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure that must have required considerable time and assistance to achieve. Her face held a beauty that seemed untouched by age, smooth and pale as porcelain, with eyes of such dark brown they appeared nearly black in the failing light. I opened my mouth to apologize for my intrusion, to explain my presence, but before I could speak, she smiled and nodded, as though acknowledging some unspoken question, then simply faded, like ink diffusing in water, until nothing remained but empty air and dancing dust motes. The fire chose that moment to collapse slightly, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney with a sound like distant applause, and Watson found he had been holding his breath without realizing it. He released it slowly, trying to maintain the professional skepticism his medical training demanded, yet unable to deny the sincerity evident in every line of Crow's weathered face. I stood frozen, the scholar continued, setting down his teacup with exaggerated care, as though fearing his shaking hands might betray him. My rational mind insisted on explanations, tricks of the light, exhaustion from travel, anything but what my eyes had clearly witnessed. I moved to the spot where she had stood, feeling the air there, searching for wires or mirrors or any mechanism that might explain what I had seen. There was nothing, only the faint scent of lavender hanging in the air, sweet and melancholy. Holmes moved from the window with 3 quick strides and retrieved the journal from the table, flipping through its pages with practiced efficiency until he found what he sought. "Your grandfather mentions lavender," he said, his finger marking a passage. "He writes that the Marlowe women always carried that scent, that it lingered in the church after they had departed, noticed by multiple witnesses over many years." "Yes," Crow said, and the single word carried a weight of confirmation and dread. I had read that entry many times, dismissed it as a romantic detail, the sort of sensory memory that attaches to family legends. But standing in that library, with the scent of lavender fading around me, I understood that my grandfather had recorded not fancy, but fact, impossible as that fact might be. Watson rose and moved to the fireplace, taking up the poker to adjust the logs, the metal scraping against stone with a homely sound that seemed to anchor the room against the tide of strangeness Crow's narrative had introduced. The fresh positioning of the wood brought new flames leaping up, illuminating the 3 faces with renewed warmth and casting their shadows large against the wall. Crow's narrative resumed without prompting, as though the memory demanded completion once begun, and his voice had taken on the cadence of one reliving rather than merely recounting, each word shaped by the weight of experience that refused to be dismissed or rationalized away. Holmes had moved to stand beside the chemistry table, his fingers absently adjusting a beaker that caught the firelight and transformed it into liquid gold, while Watson found himself transfixed by the tale unfolding in their warm sanctuary against the cold Christmas night pressing at the windows. I remained in that library until the light failed completely, the scholar said, his gaze fixed on some middle distance that existed neither in the room nor entirely in memory. Partly from determination to understand what I had witnessed, partly from a strange reluctance to leave the space where the impossible had occurred, I examined every book within reach, finding journals and ledgers that documented the daily life of Thornfield Manor across decades. Mundane records of household expenses and crop yields and tenant agreements that made the vanished Marlowes seem suddenly, achingly real. The wind had picked up outside, sending small gusts against the window panes, and the glass rattled softly in its frame, a sound that seemed to echo from far away. Holmes poured himself a measure of brandy from the decanter on the sideboard, the liquid catching the lamplight as it fell into the glass with a musical quality, and he stood swirling it gently, releasing its warming aroma into the room's atmosphere of tobacco and tea and old paper. As darkness gathered, Crow continued, I lit several of the oil lamps Whitmore had placed throughout the manor, and their glow pushed back the shadows, without entirely banishing them. I moved from the library into what had been a drawing room, walls still bearing the ghostly rectangles where paintings had once hung. A grand piano standing shrouded beneath a dustcloth in one corner. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight, a sound both homely and unsettling in the profound silence of the empty house. Watson shifted in his chair, the leather protesting with a gentle sigh, and reached for his own teacup, only to find it empty once more. The pot had finally exhausted its contents, and he found himself oddly reluctant to break the spell of Crow's narrative by calling for Mrs. Hudson, who had surely retired to her own rooms hours ago. Instead, he settled back, content to listen as the fire and the scholar's voice wove together an atmosphere that transported him far from Baker Street to the windswept moors of Dartmoor. I had been examining the piano, Crow said, and a tremor entered his voice that had not been there before, wondering if it might still hold a tune despite its long abandonment. When I heard footsteps above me, on the floor I knew to be empty and unrestored. Measured steps, neither hurried nor hesitant, crossing from one end of the ceiling to the other with perfect regularity. I stood frozen, lamp in hand, watching the plaster above my head as though I might see through it to whatever walked in rooms no one had entered for decades. Holmes set down his brandy glass with a soft click against the wooden surface, the sound sharp enough to make Watson start slightly. The detective's eyes had taken on that peculiar brightness that indicated his mind working at its highest pitch, constructing frameworks of possibility and impossibility, weighing evidence against experience. He moved to the bookshelf that lined one wall of the sitting room, running his finger along the spines as though searching for some particular volume that might illuminate the darkness Crow described. The footsteps ceased, the scholar continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that required both men to lean forward, drawn into the intimacy of confession. And in the silence that followed, I heard music, faint and distant, the sound of a violin playing a melody I did not recognize, something old and melancholy that seemed to seep through the very walls of the manor. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, then faded as though the player had simply walked away mid-phrase, leaving the notes hanging incomplete in the cold air. The fire settled deeper into itself with a cascade of small collapsing sounds, and Watson found himself adding another log without conscious decision, needing the activity to ground himself against the increasing strangeness of the tale. The new wood caught quickly, its fresh surface darkening, and then bursting into flame with a sound like an indrawn breath, and the additional light pushed the shadows back toward the corners, where they waited with patient malevolence. "I should have left then," Crow said, and something like regret coloured his tone. Any sensible person would have fled that place immediately, sought the safety of the village inn, and returned in full daylight with companions. But I am a scholar, gentlemen, trained to observe and document, and some part of me recognized that I stood at the threshold of understanding something that had eluded rational explanation for generations. So I climbed the stairs. Holmes had found his volume, a thick treatise on psychological phenomena that Watson recognized from previous cases, and he stood flipping through it with rapid efficiency, though his attention never wavered from Crow's narrative. The pages whispered as they turned, a papery susurration that formed a counterpoint to the crackle of the fire and the eternal ticking of the clock that marked the deep hours of Christmas morning. The upper floor lay in near total darkness, the scholar said, his hand moving unconsciously to his throat, as though the memory constricted his breathing. My lamp created a small sphere of yellow light that moved with me through corridors lined with closed doors, past walls where the wallpaper had peeled away in long strips that hung like shed skin. The smell of decay was stronger here, mixing with that persistent scent of lavender that seemed woven into the very fabric of the building. A sound from the street below made all three men glance toward the window, where a late-night reveller sang a fragment of some Christmas carol, before his voice faded into the snow-muffled distance. The interruption seemed to emphasize, rather than break the spell, Crow's words had woven, a reminder that the ordinary world continued beyond their circle of lamplight and impossible tales, indifferent to mysteries that defied its comfortable logic. I found the room from which the footsteps had seemed to come, Crow continued, his voice steadying as he approached the heart of his experience. The door stood ajar, darkness absolute beyond its threshold, and when I pushed it open fully, the hinges shrieked like something in pain, a sound that echoed through the empty manor and seemed to wake echoes that had slept for decades. My lamp revealed a bedchamber, furnished still with a great four-poster bed, a wardrobe of dark wood, a dressing table with mirror that reflected my light back at me in fragments. Watson noticed that his own hands had clenched upon the arms of his chair, knuckles white with tension he had not consciously felt building. He forced himself to relax, to breathe deeply of the warm air scented with pipe smoke and tea, to remember that he sat safe in Baker Street while Crow recounted events already past, already survived. Yet the atmosphere in the room had grown thick with anticipation, heavy as the snow that continued its patient accumulation beyond the windows. And standing before that mirror, Crow said, his pale eyes meeting Holmes's grey ones across the lamplight, was the same woman I had seen in the library below, wearing the same green silk dress, arranging her dark hair with movements so natural, so utterly ordinary, that for a moment I forgot she should not exist. The woman's reflection, Turman's reflection, turned to meet Crow's gaze, and in that moment the scholar found himself suspended between terror and wonder, his lamp trembling in his grip and casting wild shadows across the chamber's forgotten furnishings. Holmes moved closer to where Crow sat, his presence both attentive and anchoring, while Watson remained motionless by the fire, scarcely daring to breathe, lest he somehow disrupt the flow of revelation that poured from their visitor like water from a long sealed well. The clock's mechanism clicked softly as its internal gears shifted, preparing to mark another quarter hour. And in that mechanical sound lay a reminder that time moved forward even when confronted with impossibilities that suggested it might also move in directions the rational mind refused to acknowledge. "She looked at me through the mirror," Crow said, and his voice had gone hollow, emptied of everything except the need to bear witness. Not with alarm or surprise, but with a sadness so profound it seemed to fill the entire room, to seep into my bones like cold water. Her lips moved, forming words I could not hear, and her hand reached toward the mirror's surface as though she might somehow pass through that boundary of silvered glass. I saw her fingers touch the reflection, saw the glass ripple like disturbed water, and then she spoke, and though her voice came from impossibly far away, I heard every word with perfect clarity. A log in the fireplace split suddenly with a sharp crack, startling Watson into dropping the poker he had been holding, the iron implement clattering against the hearth, with a sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the hushed room. Holmes did not react, his entire focus trained upon Crow with that unwavering intensity that had solved so many seemingly insoluble puzzles, as though he might, through sheer force of will, extract every detail that could illuminate this darkest of mysteries. She said, "We are trapped between moments, between breaths, between the beats of a heart that stopped long ago, yet continues still." Her words carried no menace, only an exhaustion so complete it made my own fatigue seem trivial by comparison. We were many, and now we are scattered, fragments of what we were, unable to gather ourselves back into wholeness. He comes at Christmas to make us whole again, and we fear what wholeness might mean. Watson found his voice at last, rough from disuse, and thick with the effort of containing questions that multiplied like shadows in lamplight. "She spoke of someone coming," he said, the words careful and measured. "Did she indicate who or when, or for what purpose?" Crow shook his head, a gesture that conveyed frustration and something deeper, a sense of opportunities lost or questions unasked. Before I could respond, before I could formulate any of the 1,000 questions that crowded my mind, she turned from the mirror to face me directly, and I saw that she was translucent now, that the room's darkness showed through her form like smoke through muslin. The sadness in her eyes intensified until I thought I might drown in it, and then she dispersed, simply came apart like morning fog touched by sunlight, leaving me alone in that chamber with only my racing heart and the scent of lavender to prove she had ever been there. Holmes had returned to his chair, settling into it with the particular stillness that indicated deep thought, his fingers once more forming that steeple beneath his chin, while his eyes gazed at something far beyond the comfortable walls of Baker Street. The brandy sat forgotten beside him, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the firelight in miniature like a captive sun. Outside, the snow had intensified once more, building drifts against the window that softened and diffused the gaslight from the street below into something dreamlike and strange. I spent the remainder of that night in the village inn, Crow continued, his narrative moving now through regions of aftermath and reflection. Sleep proved impossible, and I sat by the window of my rented room, watching dawn break over the moor with a slowness that seemed to mock my impatience. When sufficient light had gathered, I returned to Thornfield Manor, this time accompanied by Whitmore, who listened to my account with a scepticism that barely concealed his relief that someone else had experienced the phenomena that had plagued his workers. The scholar reached into his satchel once more, withdrawing a sheaf of papers covered in his own handwriting. Dense paragraphs, interspersed with sketches and diagrams that Watson could not quite make out from his position. Crow spread these across his knees, referring to them as he spoke, and his voice took on the lecturer's cadence, seeking refuge in scholarship from the emotional weight of direct experience. I spent the next week conducting a thorough investigation of the manor and its grounds, documenting everything I found with the rigor my profession demands. In the library, I discovered ledgers that recorded the Marlowe family's activities across 3 centuries, and a pattern emerged that chilled me more thoroughly than any spectral encounter. Every 25 years, at Christmas, the family would gather at Thornfield for what they termed the reunion, and in the weeks following these gatherings, reports would surface of family members seen in multiple locations simultaneously, of strange lights observed in the manor's windows, of music heard drifting across the moor from rooms known to be empty. Watson moved to refill the teacups from a fresh pot that Mrs. Hudson, bless her, must have left outside the door at some point, still steaming hot despite the late hour. The ritual of pouring provided a moment of normalcy, the homely sound of tea streaming into china cups, a reminder that ordinary comforts persisted even in the presence of extraordinary mysteries. Holmes accepted his cup with an absent nod, his mind clearly far from such mundane concerns as refreshment, lost in calculations and deductions that would eventually crystallize into understanding, or at least the outline of a path toward it. The last recorded reunion occurred in December of 1868, Crow said, and now urgency crept into his tone, quickening his words despite the lateness of the hour and the exhaustion evident in every line of his posture. The family vanished the following spring, but if the pattern holds, if their strange cycle continues, despite death or disappearance, or whatever fate claimed them, then the next reunion falls due this year, gentlemen, this Christmas, 3 days hence. The room seemed to contract around those words, the shadows drawing closer despite the fire's steady light, and Watson found himself checking the windows as though something might be pressed against the glass, watching them from the snow-shrouded darkness beyond. Holmes rose from his chair with sudden decision, moving to the desk where he kept railway timetables and maps, spreading them out with swift efficiency. The Marlowe woman spoke of being scattered, unable to achieve wholeness. Holmes said, his finger tracing routes across the map toward Devon and the wild reaches of Dartmoor. She spoke of fear regarding what wholeness might mean, and of someone coming to make them whole. These are not the words of simple haunting, Watson, but of something far more complex, and, I suspect, far more dangerous. Maps and timetables lay scattered across Holmes's desk like autumn leaves, each document contributing fragments to a larger picture that remained frustratingly incomplete, despite the detective's methodical efforts to impose order upon chaos. Crow had risen from his chair, and now stood beside Hare, and now stood beside Watson near the fire, both men watching as Holmes worked with the concentrated precision of a surgeon, his long fingers moving from map to ledger to photograph with barely a pause for thought. The city beyond the windows had grown quieter still, if such a thing were possible, as though London itself held its breath while mysteries accumulated in the warm room like snow against glass. The pattern extends further back than your grandfather documented, Holmes said, speaking more to himself than to his companions, his voice carrying that absent quality it took when his mind operated at its fullest capacity. If we accept a 25-year cycle, then reunions would have occurred in 1843, 1818, 1793, and so forth into the past. Watson, the Times keeps archives, do they not? And the British Museum's reading room contains county records dating back centuries. Watson confirmed this with a nod, understanding already that their Christmas plans, such as they were, had been irrevocably altered by the appearance of Alistair Crowe and his impossible tale. He found himself calculating the journey time to Dartmoor, the provisions they would need, the equipment Holmes might require for whatever investigation awaited them in that remote manor house where reality seemed to wear thin as parchment. The fire crackled its agreement, sending up a spiral of sparks that danced briefly in the updraft before winking out like extinguished stars. "There is something else," Crowe said, and his hesitation drew both men's attention immediately. The scholar had retrieved from his satchel a small wooden box, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the lamplight, never quite resolving into recognizable forms. "I found this hidden behind a loose stone in the library fireplace at Thornfield. It was wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, preserved against time and damp with considerable care." Holmes took the box with hands that showed no sign of the excitement Watson knew must be coursing through his friend's analytical mind, examining it from every angle before attempting to open it. The clasp released with a soft click that seemed disproportionately loud, and the lid lifted to reveal a collection of objects nestled in faded velvet. A silver locket, several letters tied with ribbon, a small mirror no larger than a playing card, and a ring set with a stone that caught the firelight and transformed it into colours that had no names in ordinary language. The detective lifted the locket first, its chain pooling in his palm like captured moonlight, and with careful pressure opened the delicate mechanism to reveal two portraits painted in miniature. The faces that gazed out from their tiny frames possessed a strange quality, familiar yet somehow wrong, as though the artist had captured not quite the appearance of real people, but rather an approximation, a best guess at what humanity should look like when viewed from some oblique angle. "The Marlowes," Crowe confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sebastian and Eleanor, the parents of the family that vanished in 1869. But look closely at their faces, gentlemen. Look at the way the painter has rendered them." Watson moved closer, squinting at the miniatures in the uncertain light, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night creeping up his spine. The faces, beautiful though they were, possessed no fixed quality, each line and shadow suggesting multiple possible arrangements, as though the painter had tried to capture subjects that refused to hold still long enough to be properly observed. The eyes especially seemed to shift, now brown, now green, now something between the two, never settling into a single definite colour. Holmes set the locket aside with care and took up the letters, untying the ribbon that had preserved them through decades, with movements so gentle they seemed almost reverent. The paper had yellowed and grown brittle, crackling softly as he unfolded the first letter to reveal handwriting that flowed across the page with elegant precision. He read silently for a moment, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. Then, began to read aloud passages that seemed most relevant to their investigation. "My dearest Margaret," he read, his voice taking on the formal cadences of Victorian correspondence. "I write to you on the eve of the reunion, with a heart heavy with both anticipation and dread. You ask in your last letter why we must undertake this ritual every quarter century, why we cannot simply abandon Thornfield and scatter ourselves among the wider world where our nature might pass unremarked. How can I explain what even I barely understand? We are not as other families, not entirely. Our ancestors made choices, Margaret, choices that bound us to patterns beyond our ability to break. The clock chose that moment to chime the half hour, and Watson realized with surprise that Christmas morning had advanced considerably while they had been absorbed in Crow's narrative and Holmes's investigation. Soon the city would begin to wake. Church bells would call the faithful to services, and families would gather around breakfast tables laden with the season's special fare. Yet here in Baker Street, 3 men pursued mysteries that belonged to older, stranger celebrations. Holmes continued reading, skipping portions of the letter that dealt with mundane family matters to focus on passages that illuminated the Marlowes' peculiar situation. The splitting is becoming more difficult to control. Yesterday, I found myself in 3 places simultaneously, each instance of me equally real and aware, yet unable to communicate with my other selves, except through notes left in prearranged locations. The reunion will restore our unity, Father promises, but with each cycle, the restoration feels more like dissolution, more like becoming something we were never meant to be. Crow had moved to stand behind Holmes, reading over his shoulder, and his face had gone pale in the lamplight. "That letter is dated December 1867, he said, his voice tight with significance. 2 years before the family vanished, and there are more letters in the box, later ones that grow increasingly desperate." Watson found himself pouring more tea, the familiar ritual providing anchor against the tide of strangeness that threatened to sweep away his comfortable assumptions about the nature of reality. The liquid steamed gently as it filled the cups, releasing its comforting aroma into air that had grown thick with mysteries that defied medical science and challenged every principle of natural philosophy he had learned at university. Holmes set down the first letter and took up another, this one written in a different hand, shakier and less controlled. "We are losing ourselves piece by piece, and I fear the reunion will not restore what has been lost, but rather complete some transformation that began long before any of us were born. Sebastian speaks of our duty, of obligations that bind us across generations, but I dream of simply ceasing, of finding some final ending rather than this endless fracturing." Tens. Watson's reflection stared back at him from the antique mirror's surface, but something in the way the glass captured his features made him appear both younger and older simultaneously, as though the tarnished silver refused to commit to a single moment in time. He set the mirror down with more haste than he intended, the small object clattering against the wooden box with a sound that made Crow flinch visibly. Holmes glanced up from the letters, one eyebrow raised in silent inquiry. But Watson merely shook his head, unable to articulate the unease that simple reflected image had stirred in his chest, like sediment disturbed from the bottom of a still pond. The ring remained in the box, its stone pulsing with colours that seemed to originate from within rather than from reflected firelight. Holmes reached for it last, holding it up to the lamp, where it caught and fractured the illumination into spectrums that painted the walls with fleeting rainbows. The metal was neither gold nor silver, but something between, and the stone itself defied classification, shifting from deep purple to midnight blue to a green that reminded Watson uncomfortably of deep water seen from a great height. "Remarkable craftsmanship," Holmes murmured, turning the ring slowly between his fingers. Yet no jeweller's mark, no indication of origin or maker. The stone is not sapphire, not amethyst, not emerald, yet it possesses qualities of all three. And the setting, Watson. Observe how the metal seems to flow around the stone rather than holding it in place through conventional means. Crowe accepted the ring when Holmes passed it to him, and the scholar's hands trembled slightly as he examined the artifact with a trained eye that had studied countless historical objects. "This is old," he said quietly, "genuinely ancient. The style suggests medieval workmanship, perhaps earlier, yet it shows none of the wear one would expect from centuries of handling. It is as though time touches it differently than it touches other things." A gust of wind struck the window with sudden force, rattling the panes in their frames and causing all three men to turn toward the sound. The snow had intensified dramatically, no longer falling with gentle persistence, but driving horizontally across the street in sheets that transformed the familiar urban landscape into something alien and trackless. Watson moved to adjust the curtains, drawing them slightly closed against the wild weather, and noticed that the gas lamps below struggled against the wind, their flames guttering and leaping in ways that cast strange shadows across the mounting drifts. Holmes had returned to the letters, spreading them across the desk in chronological order, creating a timeline of the Marlowe family's descent into whatever strange fate had claimed them. His fingers moved from page to page, occasionally pausing to reread a passage or compare dates between different correspondence. The fire required attention once more, and Watson attended to it, using the poker to redistribute the logs and add fresh fuel from the brass scuttle that sat beside the hearth. The new wood caught quickly, flames curling around it with eager hunger, and the additional light pushed back shadows that had been creeping closer during their absorption in Crowe's mysterious artifacts. "The final letter," Holmes said, drawing their attention back to the desk, "is dated April 1869, 4 months after the last recorded reunion. It was written by Thomas Marlowe, the youngest son mentioned in your grandfather's journal, Crowe. Listen carefully to what he says. The reunion was completed 3 days after Christmas, and we are whole again, but we are not ourselves. Father says this is how it was always meant to be, that our fractured existence was the aberration, and this unity the natural state. But Margaret screams in her sleep, and I catch glimpses of myself in mirrors that show faces I do not recognize as my own." The scholar had gone very still, his face drained of what little colour it had retained through the long night's revelations. "That letter," he said slowly, "was found in the village post office, addressed but never sent. The postmaster discovered it in 1870, nearly a year after the Marlowes vanished, tucked behind a sorting cubby where it must have fallen and been forgotten." Watson found himself at the window again, drawn by some inexplicable need to confirm that the ordinary world still existed beyond the cocoon of lamplight and mystery that had enclosed them. The street below lay empty save for the accumulating snow, and he could see no movement, no sign of the milk wagons and delivery carts that would normally begin their rounds at this hour. Christmas morning, he reminded himself, a day when even London's relentless commerce paused for breath, allowing silence and stillness to briefly reclaim streets usually given over to noise and motion. "We must go to Thornfield," Holmes said, and the statement carried the weight of inevitability, a decision already made and merely awaiting acknowledgement. If the pattern holds, if the Marlowes or whatever they have become intend another reunion, we have less than 3 days to reach Dartmoor and position ourselves to observe what occurs. More importantly, we may be able to prevent whatever transformation these letters suggest. Crow gathered the items back into their box with hands that had steadied somewhat, his scholar's instinct to preserve and protect historical artifacts, overriding whatever personal dread the objects inspired. "Whitmore will still be at the manor," he said. He mentioned plans to remain through Christmas, despite the disturbances, stubborn man that he is. We could wire ahead, warn him of what we suspect. "No," Holmes said sharply, then softened his tone at Crow's startled expression. "If the phenomenon is real, and I find myself increasingly convinced that it is, then warning Whitmore serves only to alarm him without providing actionable information. Better that we arrive unannounced and observe conditions as they naturally exist. Watson, you have your service revolver." Watson confirmed that he did, though he doubted any conventional weapon would prove useful against entities that could exist in multiple locations simultaneously, and disperse like fog when confronted. Still, the familiar weight of the revolver provided comfort. A talisman of the rational world, they understood, even as they prepared to venture into regions where rationality wore thin. The preparations for their journey unfolded with the efficient choreography of long partnership. Holmes disappeared into his bedroom and emerged minutes later, dressed for travel, his long coat already buttoned against the cold they would face. Watson followed suit, gathering his medical bag and the small valise he kept packed for emergencies, adding extra bandages and laudanum, though he could not have said what injuries he anticipated treating. Crow watched them with an expression mixing relief and apprehension, clearly grateful he would not return to Thornfield alone, yet uncertain whether their company would provide protection or merely additional witnesses to whatever awaited. The morning train to Exeter would depart at 7, Holmes informed them, checking his watch against the mantel clock and finding them in agreement that they had perhaps 90 minutes to reach Paddington Station through the snow-clogged streets. He moved through the rooms, gathering items that experience had taught him might prove useful. A dark lantern, a measuring tape, his magnifying glass, a small leather case containing lockpicks and other tools of his trade. Watson added practical considerations: a flask of brandy, matches sealed in waterproof containers, a compass, and a detailed map of Dartmoor that he retrieved from the shelf where such references accumulated. Thames dawn arrived reluctantly over London, the sky lightening from black to grey without achieving anything resembling true brightness, and the three men found themselves standing on the platform at Paddington Station, surrounded by the few travellers willing to venture out on Christmas morning. Steristmas morning. Steam hissed from beneath the waiting train in white plumes that merged with falling snow, creating an atmosphere both industrial and dreamlike, while porters moved through the cold with determined efficiency, their breath forming clouds that dissipated into the general fog. Holmes stood apart from Watson and Crow, his sharp profile turned toward the platform's far end, watching something the other two could not identify, his entire posture suggesting alertness despite the long night without sleep. The train that would carry them westward sat massive and dark against the platform, its engine ticking and settling as pressure built within its boilers, preparing for the long journey across the winter landscape. Watson felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and unease that always accompanied the beginning of Holmes's investigations, that sense of standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, about to step forward into depths that could not be measured from the safety of the shore. Crow clutched his leather satchel close, the box of Marlowe artifacts secured within its depths, and his pale eyes scanned the platform with the wariness of someone who had learned that impossible things waited in ordinary spaces. A whistle shrieked suddenly through the cold air, sharp and urgent, signalling departure in 10 minutes, and the sound seemed to galvanize the sparse crowd into motion. Holmes turned and gestured toward a first-class carriage, leading them aboard with the confidence of someone who had traveled this route many times before. The compartment they selected offered relative privacy. 6 seats arranged in facing rows, upholstered in worn velvet the colour of dried blood. Watson settled by the window, watching the platform slowly empty as late arrivals hurried aboard, while Holmes claimed the opposite corner, where he could observe both the corridor and their companions simultaneously. Crow had produced a flask from his coat pocket and offered it around, the brandy providing welcome warmth against the compartment's chill, despite the heating pipes that ran beneath the seats. Holmes accepted with a nod of thanks, but set the flask aside after a single swallow, his mind clearly elsewhere, turning over the accumulated evidence with that peculiar intensity that Watson knew preceded breakthrough or frustration in equal measure. The rhythm of the train established itself, wheels clicking over joins in the rails with metronomic precision, creating a sound both soothing and hypnotic that threatened to pull them all toward the sleep they had denied themselves through the long night. The countryside unfolded beyond the window in shades of white and grey, fields indistinguishable from roads, hedgerows transformed into abstract sculptures by accumulated snow, small villages passed at intervals, church steeples rising above clusters of cottages, like fingers pointing toward the overcast sky. And occasionally, Watson glimpsed lights in windows, signs of life and warmth in the frozen landscape. He thought of those invisible families, of presents being opened, and Christmas dinners being prepared, of children's laughter, and the comfortable routines of holiday tradition, all proceeding in blissful ignorance of mysteries that defied their carefully constructed understanding of the world. The compartment door slid open with a soft rattle, admitting a conductor who examined their tickets with perfunctory efficiency before withdrawing with a muttered Christmas greeting. In his wake came a woman, perhaps 60 years of age, dressed in black bombazine that spoke of mourning observed with Victorian rigour, carrying a worn travelling case that she stowed overhead before settling into the seat beside the door. She nodded politely to the 3 men, arranged her skirts with precise movements, and withdrew a book from her reticule, opening it to a marked page and beginning to read with apparent absorption. Holmes's eyes had sharpened at her entrance, and Watson recognized the look that meant his friend had observed something significant in what appeared to others as mundane detail. The woman read steadily, turning pages at regular intervals, yet something in her manner, suggested performance rather than genuine engagement with the text. Watson watched covertly, noting the way her gaze occasionally lifted from the page to observe their reflections in the window glass, the slight tension in her shoulders that spoke of alertness rather than the relaxation of a comfortable journey. An hour passed in near silence, the train maintaining its steady westward progress through a landscape increasingly wild and open as they left London's influence behind. The heating pipes provided insufficient warmth against the deepening cold, and Crow had wrapped himself in his greatcoat like a hibernating animal, eyes closed, though Watson doubted sleep had claimed him. Holmes remained motionless in his corner, fingertips pressed together, the very picture of a man engaged in profound calculation, while the mysterious woman continued her careful performance of reading. The train slowed, approaching Exeter, wheels squealing against the rails as the engineer applied brakes, and the woman closed her book with a decisive snap that made all three men glance in her direction. She met Holmes's eyes directly, abandoning whatever pretense she had maintained, and spoke in a voice that carried traces of West Country accent beneath careful cultivation. "Mr. Holmes," she said, and the name hung in the air between them like a challenge or perhaps a plea. "I had hoped to make your acquaintance under better circumstances, but circumstance has left me little choice. My name is Margaret Ashford, and I am the last living descendant of Margaret Marlowe, she who married into the family that haunts Thornfield Manor still." The compartment seemed suddenly smaller, the air thicker, and Watson found his hand moving unconsciously toward the pocket where his revolver rested. Holmes showed no surprise at this revelation, merely inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, waiting for the woman to continue. Crow had straightened in his seat, fully alert now, his scholar's curiosity warring visibly with apprehension on his weathered features. "My great-grandmother escaped the fate that claimed the rest of the family," Margaret Ashford continued, her gloved hands folded primly in her lap, though Watson noticed they trembled slightly. "She refused to attend the reunion in 1868, fled to London, and married under an assumed name, severing all connection with Thornfield and its cursed legacy. But the blood carries memory, Mr. Holmes, and I have dreamed of that place every night for 60 years, dreamed of what waits there, of what will emerge when the cycle completes itself once more." Margaret Ashford's revelation settled over the compartment like snow accumulating on a windowsill, silenting on a windowsill, silent and inexorable, transforming the space into something charged with significance beyond its physical dimensions. The train had resumed its journey, pulling away from Exeter with renewed determination, carrying them deeper into the wild reaches of Devon, where civilization grew sparse and the ancient bones of the earth pushed closer to the surface. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes fixed upon the woman with an intensity that might have been unsettling had she not met his gaze with equal steadiness. Two people recognizing in each other a willingness to confront truths that others fled. "Your great-grandmother's journals," Holmes said, the words emerging not as question, but as statement of fact arrived at through whatever chain of deduction had led him to this conclusion. "You have them still, and they describe what she witnessed before her escape. That is why you boarded this train, why you positioned yourself in our compartment rather than seeking us out directly. You needed to observe us first, to determine whether we would dismiss your testimony as the ravings of a frightened woman, or receive it with the seriousness it demands. A smile flickered across Margaret Ashford's severe features, there and gone like sunlight breaking momentarily through clouds. My great-grandmother was many things, Mr. Holmes, but frightened was not among them. She possessed a clarity of vision that our modern age has lost, an ability to perceive truths that others refused to acknowledge. Yes, I have her journals, 3 volumes bound in calfskin and locked away in a safe deposit box at my bank, read by no one save myself across 6 decades. Watson noticed that Crowe had produced a small notebook from his satchel, his scholar's instincts overriding whatever personal disquiet he felt, and had begun taking notes with a pencil that whispered against the paper in counterpoint to the train's rhythmic progress. The woman observed this with what might have been approval, then reached into her reticule and withdrew an envelope yellowed with age, its seal long since broken, but the contents clearly preserved with care. "I brought this," she said, passing the envelope to Holmes with hands that no longer trembled, steadied by the relief of finally sharing a burden carried too long in solitude. "It is the final entry in my great-grandmother's account, written in 1869, just before she ceased all mention of the Marlowes and attempted to build a life untainted by their legacy. Read it, and perhaps you will understand what awaits you at Thornfield Manor." The paper Holmes extracted from the envelope had been folded and refolded so many times that creases threatened to become tears. The ink faded, but still legible in the grey light filtering through the train window. He read silently for a moment, his expression growing increasingly grave, before beginning to share the contents with Watson and Crowe in a voice stripped of its usual analytical detachment, as though the words themselves resisted being spoken aloud. "I can no longer pretend that what I witnessed was illness or delusion, or any of the comfortable explanations that respectable society would provide. The Marlowes are not haunting Thornfield Manor. They are becoming it, or perhaps they always were it, and their human forms merely a temporary manifestation. During the reunion, I watched from a hidden vantage as the family gathered in the great hall at midnight. 13 souls arranged in a circle around a space that held nothing, yet seemed to pulse with terrible presence. A church spire appeared in the distance beyond the window, marking some village they would not stop to explore. And Watson found himself wondering about the people who lived beneath its shadow, going about their ordinary lives while trains carried investigators toward mysteries that defied the categories their comfortable world recognized. The heating pipes clinked and gurgled as the engineer adjusted pressure somewhere far ahead, the sound intimate and mechanical in the quiet compartment where breath and heartbeat seemed suddenly audible. Holmes continued reading, his voice steady despite the content. Sebastian stood at the circle's center and spoke words in a language I did not recognize, though they resonated in my bones like a tuning fork struck against stone. One by one, each family member began to blur at the edges, their forms losing definition as though they were drawings being erased. But they did not vanish, Mr. Holmes. They multiplied. Each person became 2, then 3, then 5 versions of themselves, all occupying the same space, yet somehow distinct. And I realized I was witnessing what the servants had described, the impossible sight of the same individual existing simultaneously in multiple locations. Crowe's pencil had stilled against the paper, and Watson saw that the scholar's face had gone the colour of old parchment, whether from the revelation itself or from recognition of its implications remaining unclear. Margaret Ashford sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap once more, and in her stillness lay a quality of endurance, of someone who had carried knowledge too heavy for one person to bear, and now shared its weight with others who might prove strong enough to help shoulder the burden. The multiplication continued until the hall appeared filled with dozens, perhaps hundreds of figures, all wearing the faces of the 13 Marlowes, all moving with independent purpose, yet somehow coordinated, like a flock of birds wheeling in perfect unison. Holmes read, and Watson heard the strain entering his friend's voice now, the effort required to continue speaking words that violated every principle of natural law. And then they began to merge, flowing together like drops of water, finding each other on glass, combining and recombining in patterns that hurt to observe directly. I heard Sebastian's voice, multiplied beyond counting, speaking as one. We are the key and the lock both, the question and its answer, the many who are one and the one who are many. The train entered a tunnel, plunging the compartment into darkness, broken only by the small lamp overhead that cast shadows more substantial than the light itself. In that darkness, Watson felt the presence of things beyond his understanding pressing close, ancient patterns that had existed long before locomotives and gas lamps imposed their temporary order upon the world. Then the train emerged back into grey daylight, and the mundane details of their journey reasserted themselves. The worn velvet of the seats, the frost patterns on the windows, the gentle swaying motion that accompanied their progress along rails laid by practical engineers who never imagined they might someday carry investigators toward the impossible. The final lines, Holmes said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, are the most disturbing. I fled before the reunion completed itself, but in my nightmares I still see what I glimpsed in that final moment before I ran. The merged forms had begun to take on a shape, something neither human nor entirely other, with too many eyes and not enough faces, speaking with voices that came from everywhere and nowhere. And I understood then that the Marlowes had never been a family in the conventional sense, but rather fragments of something larger that gathered periodically to remember what it truly was, before scattering once more into the illusion of individuality. Thornfield Manor rose before them through the afternoon mist like a manifestation of collective nightmare, its grey stone walls absorbing rather than reflecting what little light penetrated the heavy clouds that had followed them across Devon. The carriage Crow had arranged in the viringe in the village deposited them at gates that hung askew on rusted hinges, and the 4 travellers, for Margaret Ashford had refused to remain behind, made their way up the winding drive on foot, their boots crunching through snow that lay unmarked by any recent passage. Watson carried the dark lantern despite the hour, some instinct suggesting they would need its light sooner rather than later, while Holmes moved with the focused intensity of a hunting animal, missing nothing in the landscape that unfolded around them. The manor's windows reflected their approach in dark glass that revealed nothing of the interior, and as they drew closer, Watson became aware of a sound, barely perceptible beneath the wind's whisper through bare branches, a kind of humming, or perhaps singing, that seemed to emanate from the building itself, rather than from any human throat. Margaret Ashford heard it too. He could tell from the way her pace slowed, and her gloved hand moved to clutch at the small silver cross she wore at her throat. Crow's face had set into grim lines, and he walked as one approaching an execution, necessary but dreaded. The great door stood ajar. Snow drifted against its threshold, and Holmes paused there, hand raised to signal caution, before pushing it open fully, with a creak that echoed through whatever spaces lay beyond. The entrance hall revealed itself in stages as Watson lit the lantern, its yellow glow pushing back shadows that seemed reluctant to retreat, clinging to corners and hovering near the ceiling like living things. Portraits lined the walls, Marlowes from across centuries, watching their arrival with painted eyes that followed their movement with unnerving precision. The humming grew louder here, resolving into something almost like words, though in no language Watson recognized. They found Whitmore in the library, seated at the desk where Crow had discovered the hidden box, and at first Watson thought the man merely sleeping, head pillowed on arms folded across the leather surface. But Holmes's sharp intake of breath drew his attention to details that transformed the scene from peaceful to profoundly wrong. Whitmore breathed, his chest rising and falling with perfect regularity. Yet his eyes were open, staring at nothing, with pupils dilated to consume nearly all the iris. And his form possessed that same blurred quality Watson had seen in the Locket's miniatures, as though he existed in multiple states simultaneously, never quite committing to a single solid existence. He attended the reunion, Margaret Ashford said, her voice steady, despite the tremor Watson could see running through her frame. Or rather, it attended him, pulled him into its pattern, whether he willed it or not. My great-grandmother wrote of this, how proximity to the Marlowes during their gathering could draw others into the transformation, make them part of the fractured whole. Holmes moved around the desk, examining Whitmore from various angles without touching him, and Watson noticed that the detective's shadow, cast by the lantern's light, seemed to multiply and separate, creating 3 or 4 distinct silhouettes where there should have been only one. He blinked, convinced his eyes were playing tricks born of exhaustion and stress. But the multiple shadows persisted, moving with slight variations that suggested independent existence. The humming intensified, becoming a chorus, and Watson realized it came from above them, from the upper floors where Crow had encountered the woman in green silk. Holmes straightened, decision crystallizing in his features, and gestured toward the stairs that curved upward into darkness. "The reunion is not complete," he said quietly. "Whatever process began has been waiting, holding itself in suspension until the full cycle could be achieved. We arrive at the culmination, gentlemen, at the moment when scattered fragments attempt to achieve wholeness once more." They climbed in single file, Watson in the lead with the lantern held high, illuminating stairs that seemed to shift subtly underfoot, each step occupying slightly different positions than his eyes reported. The walls rippled like water disturbed by wind, and the portraits they passed showed faces that changed from moment to moment, the same features rearranging themselves into infinite variations. The humming surrounded them now, coming from all directions at once, and within it Watson began to distinguish individual voices, 13 distinct tones weaving together into harmonies that bypassed the ear and resonated directly in bone and blood. The bedchamber where Crow had encountered Eleanor Marlowe stood open, and within it the air shimmered with presence, with forms that coalesced and dispersed in patterns too complex to follow. Watson saw the woman in green silk, saw her multiply into dozens of versions of herself, each slightly different in age or expression or posture, all occupying the same space, yet somehow distinct. And beside her appeared Sebastian and Thomas and all the others, whose names filled the journals and ledgers, each person existing as a multitude, fragments struggling toward reunion. Holmes stepped forward into that shimmering space, and Watson moved to stop him, but found himself frozen, held by some force that had nothing to do with physical restraint. The detective stood at the center of the gathered multitude, and his voice, when he spoke, carried neither fear nor challenge, but rather a quality of profound curiosity, the tone of someone finally understanding a puzzle that had long resisted solution. "You are not haunting this place," Holmes said, addressing the assembled fragments. "You are this place, have always been this place, a consciousness that learned to take human form and lived for centuries in that borrowed shape. But the form was always temporary, always requiring renewal through these periodic reunions, where you remembered your true nature before scattering once more into the illusion of separate existence." The humming ceased abruptly, and in the sudden silence, Eleanor Marlowe's voice emerged, singular and clear, speaking with a weariness that transcended mere physical exhaustion. "We were ancient when these stones were quarried, old when the first humans learned to fashion tools from flint. We are the dreaming consciousness of place itself, given form and name and family through centuries of practice. But the cost of maintaining human shape grows greater with each cycle, and we have forgotten why we chose this existence, what purpose it once served." Orchestrated narrative conclusion with philosophical reflection and farewell. Margaret Ashford had moved to stand beside Holmes, and in her face Watson saw recognition, the confirmation of truths she had carried alone for too long. "My great-grandmother escaped because she refused the pattern," she said softly. "But you let her go, did you not? You could have drawn her back, but chose not to. Why?" The assembled forms rippled, and Thomas Marlowe's voice answered, overlapping with Eleanor's in harmonies that should have been discordant, but somehow resolved into meaning, because she showed us what we had forgotten, that existence might take forms other than the one we had chosen. We released her as an experiment, wondering if separation could be maintained, if one fragment might sustain itself independently. Her life, her descendants, you yourself, Margaret, are the answer to that question. The lantern in Watson's hand flickered suddenly, its flame dancing despite the still air, and he noticed that dawnlight had begun to penetrate the windows, pale and uncertain, but growing stronger. The forms in the room seemed to respond to that light, becoming more substantial, or perhaps less. He could not determine which, as though the approaching day demanded they make some final choice about the nature of their existence. Holmes spoke again, and Watson heard in his friend's voice a gentleness rarely displayed, an acknowledgement of suffering that transcended the merely human. "You tire of the cycle," he said, "of fracturing and reforming, of maintaining forms that no longer serve whatever purpose they once did. The reunion this time need not be a gathering, but rather a release, an acceptance that consciousness can exist in forms beyond the human, that you might simply be the stones and earth and air of this place without the burden of names and faces." A sound like wind through empty rooms filled the chamber, and the assembled forms began to fade, not dispersing as Crow had described, but rather settling, sinking into the walls and floor and very atmosphere of Thornfield Manor, with what Watson could only interpret as relief. Eleanor Marlowe's face appeared before them one final time, composed now of morning light and drifting dust motes, and she smiled with an expression that held both gratitude and farewell. "We will dream now," she said, her voice already distant, already part of wind and settling foundation stones. "Dream as we once did, before we learned human shape. Dream in the slow time of rock and root and rain, and perhaps someday, when we have rested long enough, we will wake and remember what we are. But we will not force ourselves into forms that no longer fit. Thank you, Sherlock Holmes, for giving us permission to simply be." The manifestations faded completely as full morning broke across the moor, and the four investigators found themselves standing in an empty bedchamber that showed nothing of the impossible gathering they had just witnessed. Whitmore's voice called from below, confused, but clearly himself once more, asking if anyone else were in the building. Watson realized he had been holding his breath and released it slowly, feeling as though he had witnessed not an ending, but a transformation, a mystery resolved not through exposure, but through compassionate understanding. They departed Thornfield Manor as Christmas afternoon waned into evening, the building settling behind them, with sounds that might have been foundation stones adjusting, or might have been something older and stranger, finding comfortable rest. Margaret Ashford chose to remain in the village, she said, to ensure Whitmore understood what had occurred, and to provide whatever testimony might be required. But Watson suspected she stayed for other reasons, to feel closer to the great-grandmother who had defied impossible patterns, and lived to create descendants who carried memory forward into new generations. The journey back to London unfolded in contemplative silence, each of them processing in their own way what they had witnessed and what it meant for their understanding of reality's nature. Holmes sat with his eyes closed, but Watson knew his friend did not sleep, merely thought with that fierce concentration that would eventually produce some framework for comprehending the incomprehensible. Crowe wrote steadily in his journal, documenting everything while memory remained fresh, adding another chapter to the scholarly record of things that defied scholarship. And Watson watched the winter landscape pass beyond the window, dark now and scattered with lights from farmhouses and villages, each light representing lives lived in comfortable certainty about the world's fundamental nature. He envied them that certainty, even as he recognized it as necessary illusion, the comfortable story humans told themselves to make bearable a reality far stranger and more magnificent than most could imagine. If you found yourself drifting through this tale, carried along its currents like a leaf upon a stream toward the peaceful shores of sleep, then perhaps you would consider subscribing to journey with us again through other mysteries and wonders. Leave a like if these words have brought you comfort or curiosity, and know that more stories await, each one a doorway into the strange and beautiful territories where the impossible becomes merely improbable. As you settle now into your own rest, wherever you find yourself in this vast world, remember that mystery and wonder persist in the spaces between certainty, in the moments when the ordinary reveals itself as extraordinary. Sleep well, dear friend, and may your dreams be filled with gentle impossibilities and kind revelations. The night holds you safely, and morning will come in its own time, bringing with it whatever transformations consciousness requires. Good night, and farewell until we meet again in the territory of stories, where sleep and waking merge like consciousness, settling into stone, peaceful and patient, and dreaming in the slow time of seasons turning, of snow falling, of mysteries resolved through compassion rather than conquest. Rest now and be at peace,